Good morning. I'm Amira Schiff, the Director of the Conflict Management, Resolution and Negotiation Program at Bar-Ilan University, and it is my honor and pleasure to serve as the chair of this morning session on Rabbi Sachs and his biblical Parshanut. We have a fantastic lineup of experts who will be sharing their unique perspectives and insights on this important and thought-provoking topic. I would like to ask you just to hold any questions or comments until the end of this session so that we may allow the speakers the opportunity to fully present their research. So now, without further ado, let's begin. I'm excited to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Jessica Sachs. Ms. Sachs is senior translator at Koren Publishers, Jerusalem. She has been involved in all Rabbi Sachs translation projects with Koren, most recently leading translation team for the Koren Magerman Tanakh. She is now working on preparing Rabbi Sachs' Chumash commentary for publication. Ms. Sachs will speak about the dignity of diction, the translation work of Rabbi Sachs. Ms. Sachs, please.
Yes.
Lower the mic.
So, of course, the name of this conference is Jonathan Sachs, Rabbi, Professor, Lord, Translator. Somehow that last word got missed off the posters, and it hasn't received as much attention as his various other accolades and job titles. And what I'd like to do here is to argue to you that his translation work was really up there among his really important contributions to Jewish life, give you a sense of some of the principles behind his translation choices and why he chose to translate. And of course, when we talk about Rabbi Sachs' translation work, we're talking about his retranslation of the Victorian iconic UK authorized daily prayer book. He totally retranslated that in 2006, and that became the basis then for the Koren Sidurim and the whole cycle of Koren Machzorim and Haggadah. And in 2021, the Koren Magerman Tanakh came out, and that had his translation of the Chumash, quite a varied team of translators translated Nach, each with their own style, but following the translation principles that he established, which was never a formal list of principles. It's something that developed in conversation, and I'll want to give you a sense of it through the text. And there's again, as is the tradition, there's a handout that hasn't been handed out, but it doesn't matter. Okay. Okay, so why a new translation? Why a new translation of all things of the Tanakh, the Chumash, which has been translated so many times? At Koren, we're asked that all the time, but for Rabbi Sachs, that's a more significant question because he was not a frustrated writer. He had many books of his own to write. So why did he give time to expressing someone else's ideas and thoughts, which is what translation is? I think I can give you a partial answer in his words. From a different context. This is from an introductory essay to the Rabbi Sachs Haggadah. But for Haggadah, translate in your minds, translation of the Torah, I think there are many things in common. Few texts have received more attention than the Haggadah. There are thousands of commentaries and more are published each year. Anyone who contemplates adding to this number must ask not, why is this night different, but why is this edition different? My answer is that I wrote this commentary because among all the many I have read, I could not find one that explained in their full richness and scope the fundamental themes of the Pesach story, the Jewish concept of a free society, the role of memory in shaping Jewish identity, and the unique connection that exists in Judaism between spirituality and society, giving rise to what I've called elsewhere the politics of hope. Nor could I find a Haggadah that told me in detail about the role of Pesach in shaping Jewish identity through the millennia or its influence on Western thought. Traditional commentaries are usually close readings of individual words and phrases rather than reflections on the meaning of the whole. That is a classic Jewish response, and I have not hesitated to do likewise. miss a bit, but it is the great themes, the overarching principles that are often neglected or taken for granted, and it is worth saying why. And now I'm going to butcher the next few pages into a couple of sentences. Essentially, what he says is that the Torah, the Haggadah, are not primarily about individual piety. They're about how to build a society which is compassionate and just and holy. And through the centuries of exile, Jews had very limited power to actually actualize that vision. Now we have significant influence in Israel, certainly also abroad, and it's time for us to take that step back again from the canvas and look at those overarching themes and ideas. And I would say that in the intervening years since he wrote that, the Torah has become a very major player in public life, certainly here. And the question of how we read that, whether as in a fundamentalist reading, we can clip out any given pasuk and stick it on a placard, or whether to understand the text, we have to step back from it and observe the shadow play of context and subtext, even though the shadows move as we move, whether those things are necessary parts of understanding the Torah is a very, very important question, and my fellow panelists will approach that as scholars, and I'm going to approach it now as a translator, that question. Now, this he speaks in the what I just read about the tension between the individual words and the book as a whole. Now, that's a tension that as translators we deal with on a daily basis. You can have a perfect translation from an individual word that conveys all the different meanings and all the connotations and so on of the Hebrew, and then stick it into your sentence and find that when you read the paragraph, it for some of many reasons, interrupts the reader's experience in a way that it didn't in the Hebrew. It's jarring to the whole. And then you have a dilemma, and you have to choose between the requirements of the word and your commitment to the word and your commitment to the whole. Now, that's a daily dilemma, and there's no single answer to it. But Jewish Bible translators, for good reason, have tended to privilege the word over the whole. And one of the reasons Rabbi Sachs alludes to here in the Haggadah, we are very, very attached to the words. Another reason is that we have a very strong oral tradition of translation. Jewish translation of liturgy, Tanakh, is highly unusual. Generally, if you get a translation of Bialik's poems in English, you don't have the Hebrew next to you. The translation has replaced the original text for you because the original text isn't useful to you. You don't have the skill for it. In our Jewish experience, definitely in the Orthodox world, also beyond it, the Hebrew never goes away. You even somebody who's sitting in shul who barely understands a word of the Hebrew, they're hearing the Torah reading, they're praying in the words of the Hebrew. The Hebrew is always there. And so every child in a Jewish school, and you all know this from experience, from one side of the desk or the other, is an apprentice translator. With the rhythm of the study is read a bit, translate, and that is wonderful. I hope that continues forever. But it has costs which we don't usually acknowledge. One of the costs is that as a Jew, we rarely have the experience of simply reading the text, fluency in the text. That's a goal that we shoot towards, because in trying to teach people to be fluent in biblical Hebrew, fluency in an ancient language is a very difficult concept. That's one cost. Another cost is that your average Jew in shul, using a translation because they need the translation to understand it, feels deficient, because the ideal is that he shouldn't need that translation. He's not taught to respect the written tradition of translation, and he's not taught to respect himself as a user of that translation. He is disabled because he needs it. And of course, that couldn't be further, I don't need to say it, from Rabbi Sachs's attitude to his congregation. So what I'm going to do now is a highly unusual act in Jewish life. I'm going to read to you, and I'm sorry it's not in front of you, I'm going to read to you a whole chapter in translation. This is Rabbi Sachs's translation of Shmot chapter 1, read in shul last week. And these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Yaakov, each with his household. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun, and Binyamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Yaakov were 70 in all, and Yosef was already in Egypt. Then Yosef died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and burgeoned. They multiplied and became exceptionally strong until the land was filled with them. Then a new king arose over Egypt who had not known Yosef. And he said to his people, "You see that the Israelite people are many and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them in case they increase. And if war breaks out, they may join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." So they placed slave masters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities for Pharaoh, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread, and the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians imposed back-breaking labor on the Israelites, embittering their lives with harsh work in mortar and brick and all field labors. All the work they forced upon them was intended to break them. Then the king of Egypt said to the midwives of the Hebrews, one named Shifra, the other Pu'ah, "When you help a Hebrew woman give birth, look on the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him, and if it is a girl, let her live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt ordered them. They let the babies live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and demanded, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the children live?" But Hebrew women, the midwives replied, are not like Egyptians. They're full of vigor and have already given birth by the time the midwife arrives. God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he granted them households. Then Pharaoh commanded his entire people, saying, "Throw every boy that is born into the Nile, and let the girls live." Now, I've deliberately chosen a chapter there that starts off, as we generally think of it, rather slowly. It starts with a name list, one of these sections of the Tanakh, which is list-like, shall we say. And I did that for a reason, which is I want to remind you of something that you're aware of in the Hebrew text, but we rarely talk of or think of, and translators almost universally ignore, and that is that the Hebrew text is a musical text. It's a text for performance. That's how we experience it. Although we don't think about it, our ears are attuned to it, to listen out for the nachtan, the sof pasuk. The King James is also written for performance, and people are aware of that when they read it. It's written for performance in church. But other translations, and we're not going to go into comparison, you don't have it in front of you, but trust me, just open anyone when you get home, and you'll see that they privilege, as I've said, the meaning of the word, and the musicality of the text is not are high on their priority list, if they're at all. And any Rabbi Sachs text, as we know, when we read it, we hear it in his voice. It's a text that you're allowed to get into and enjoy and experience on that aural level, as well as the meaning of the individual words. And I would have here done a comparison with the Art Scroll translation specifically, which for me represents the oral tradition of translation that I've spoken about. If you open any Art Scroll translation, you'll see that the entire translation is in italics. They want you to know, as soon as you open the book, that you shouldn't. The translation is not where you ought to be. The translation is a tool you can use if you need it, but don't make yourself at home there. That's not where it should be. It's a hyper-literal translation. The people, the children of Israel, are more numerous and stronger than me. Come, let us outsmart it, lest it becomes more numerous, and it may be. So here, you can't see it inside, but because the Hebrew uses the noun and then it goes on to use the singular masculine pronoun, lo, etc., that you would expect in Hebrew, doesn't jar on the ear at all. Well, they've taken that directly and translated the people and thereafter it, even though to an English-speaking ear it's very, very jarring and confusing to hear a group of people referred to as it. We're given the message as soon as we get in here, you cannot be left alone with this. You need the commentary below the line. Some people come to the text with a low self-confidence regarding it, and they're quite happy to have, a paternalistic translator taking them through it. And constantly reminding them that they're not competent in it. But of course, Rabbi Sachs wanted his congregants to feel competent to enjoy this text just as he does in the Hebrew. And I'm going to move on to a question of interpretation and meaning. Again, I brought the JPS and the Art Scroll here to represent two poles of a certain spectrum in Jewish interpretation. The JPS, and we won't get into details, of course, but for JPS, the ideal interpretation of the text is what we would call the pshat. Essentially, the ideal interpretation would be what the original audience understood when they heard that text. That's the unattainable ideal that they shoot towards. Whereas the Art Scroll are not interested in that. For them, the ideal understanding of the text is how the medieval commentators understood it, and that they're perfectly happy with that. That's a certain spectrum in the Jewish world. Where does Rabbi Sachs sit on that spectrum? Now, I'll tell you that he's certainly closer to the JPS. If there's new research comes to light, shedding light on the text that, let's say, Rashbam didn't have in front of us, he would assume that had Rashbam had that, he would have been interested in it, he would have wanted it. It's very unusual that a rabbinic reading contradictory to what modern research has brought up will be used in interpretation. There are one or two very interesting exceptions. For instance, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Rabbi Sachs was insistent that that should be as a response to Christian anti-Semitic interpretations of the entire Bible in light of, that was a locus of that particular brand of anti-Semitism which he felt resurging. So it was important to him to include the reception history, the Jewish reception history of that verse in the translation. Of course, footnoted, there's no intention to confuse anyone. But that's highly unusual. But I want to quickly look at a sort of intermediate example. And I'm looking at the word befarech, which is an easy word to understand, a difficult word to translate. Easy word to understand because it appears in several biblical contexts, always very clear from the context, that it means overly harsh treatment of a slave. So if you're just reading it, that's all you need to know if you're reading it in the Hebrew. If you're translating, you need a more precise definition of that word. Let's see what Rabbi Sachs does. Again, this is an unusual example, but it's illustrative. The Egyptians imposed back-breaking labor on the Israelites. All the work they forced upon them was intended to break them. Two slightly different plays on the word break, bringing in quite a broad stretch of meaning into that word. Now, where does he get that word break from? Very easy to unpick that. That's Rashi, that's Rashbam, Ibn Ezra. The medieval commentators use the word break. Where did they get it from? From Aramaic. In Aramaic, the cognate root has the sense of crushing or crumbling. Nuts, for instance. You can't, Art Scroll just translate the word as though it were Aramaic, crushing, and they make it work. But that's what Rashi had to work with, and that's what Rabbi Sachs is taking from. JPS reject that because they have something that Rashi didn't have, which is the Assyrian. And then in Assyrian, there's a cognate word with a sense of violence. So you translate ruthless, which is a very common way to translate that word now. Very kind of direct, simple translation of that word, which Rabbi Sachs is not contradictory to, but he's bringing in something extra. And so I'm going to read you a bit of as yet unpublished commentary on this. Both the previous verse and this end with the word befarech, meaning back-breaking labor, inhuman and dehumanizing work of a kind that would later be forbidden to be demanded by an Israelite of a slave among his own people. According to Egyptian documents of the period recently discovered, brick-making quotas issued by slave masters were only rarely reached. It seems, therefore, to have been a deliberate policy towards slaves and prisoners of war to set them work targets that were virtually impossible to achieve, a form of physical and mental torture that may be what the Torah is referring to here as cruel or backbreaking. So he's bringing in some context that he has found in very recent research. Interestingly, to show that, a slave master when we imagine or enact as school children the Israelites, they have a slave master with a whip standing over him. Of course, we know that that is not an efficient way to run a slave workforce, and slave masters use psychological techniques for breaking in their slaves so that their slaves will be subordinate to them even when they're not standing over them with a whip. And this is the element that Rashi didn't have. He translated, Rashi could be translated almost directly as backbreaking, and Rabbi Sachs is bringing in a new element, psychological torture. Now, I say a new element, but if we go back to Midrash Rabbah, interestingly, the Midrash intuits almost exactly what Rabbi Sachs is bringing here. One of the Midrashic interpretations of the word befarech is that on the first day when the workers were fresh, they did a certain amount, and the Egyptians said, okay, what you've done today, you have to do every day, until they were driven to complete exhaustion. Very, very close to the Assyriological context that Rabbi Sachs is bringing. Another interpretation that they bring there is giving men the work of women and women the work of men. So, in a word, a psychological technique for breaking down their sense of identity, their values, making the work against their own social norms, breaking them in. So what we see here is Rabbi Sachs, if the JPS is the most absolutely straight down the middle pshat interpretation, Rabbi Sachs is coming at it at a slight slant, bringing in influences from two directions, from the newest research he can find, and that rabbinic, midrashic sensitivity. He receives in the Hebrew a resonant text, full of echoes, full of context, full of questions, pause for thought, and he, although he can't replicate that in English, can't replicate all that precise constellation of meaning, he wants to give you in the English, whoever you are, whatever your Hebrew skills, he wants to give you a resonant text that you can also inhabit and engage with intellectually and emotionally. And there's another example here which I won't discuss, and I refer you that he wrote a whole Covenant and Conversation essay on the phrase ha-me'aldot ha-ivriot, is that Hebrew midwives or midwives to the Hebrews. And again, this is a very unusual instance where he went with a minority reading, and he did that because he wanted to open our ears to another thread in this tapestry of what's going on in this under this coercive regime in Egypt. And the last word that I will say, again, we won't go into, is another priority was to distinguish between the different genres and forms of the Tanakh. This, of course, came into its own in Nach, where you have all these different genres, and different translators were selected to translate those different types of books. But he, in the Chumash as well, he wanted there to be a distinction between prose and poetry. We've read prose now, so I'm just going to end with Bukat Kohanim in Rabbi Sachs's translation from Parashat Naso. May the Lord bless you and watch over you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord raise his face towards you and grant you peace.